The markup will come to order. We will now resume consideration of H.R. 4435. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this bill forward. Today, we take bold steps to address recidivism and sentencing disparities, provide equal access to Veterans Court treatment programs for racial and ethnic minorities and women, as well as address individuals who claim to practice immigration law and misrepresent themselves. I'm especially proud to co-lead the Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021, which would hold public notaries who abuse their power. Some of these bad actors take advantage of vulnerable communities with language barriers, or of those who cannot read or fully understand the American legal system. Many Spanish-speaking immigrants, for example, turn to notaries because in their home countries, a notario público refers to a lawyer. So H.R. 4435 criminalizes notario fraud schemes, ensuring that no one can take advantage of the literal-sounding translation of notario público. Significantly, some scammers have fraudulently used the notary public title to market themselves as authorized to provide legal advice and services, especially in immigration law. When I was a legal aid lawyer, I remember seeing firsthand many of the deceitful practices at the expense of indigent people due to their illiteracy or a language barrier. Sadly, that was wrong then, and it is still wrong today. As a member of Congress, we've gotten many of these similar complaints, so the practice still continues. We have a responsibility to protect the well-being and livelihoods of the most vulnerable among us, including immigrant families across our country. Certainly, courts have recognized the widespread prevalence of notario fraud, and the negative impact on immigrants and their families is clear. I want to thank my comadre, Congresswoman Veronica Escobar of El Paso, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, my colleague from Houston, for their leadership on this issue, and I thank them for their continued work that started with our other comadre, Debbie Mercosal-Powell of Florida, formerly with us on this committee. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. Let's put an end to these fraudulent schemes. And Mr. Chairman, I agree with Mr. Biggs. Is something we should rethink. Frankly, that's just enough for Texas. What are we do about the rest of the states? We should make sure that if we're going to ask for these cases to be prosecuted, that we have enough staff to handle the number of complaints that I know we get in Texas, that he gets in Arizona, that they get in California, New York, Florida, and I could go on and on. Mr. Chairman, this is an important piece of legislation. I urge all my colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you so much for your leadership on this issue.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Stanton seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I am proud to support H.R. 4435, the Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021. I urge my colleagues to do the same. This bill addresses an issue that affects way too many people in my home state of Arizona. Fraudsters, often without any credentials, pose as legal professionals, offering immigration services to unsuspecting targets. They prey on vulnerable immigrant communities, of whom many do not speak English as a first language. The notario provides advice and counsel as if they are an attorney, but in fact they are untrained, unlicensed, and too often malicious. The risk posed by these scams is obvious. Mistakes in immigration proceedings and paperwork carry heavy penalties, and too often the victim of these swindles is left with little or no recourse and faces threat of retaliation. The Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021 would fix this by criminalizing these fraudulent activities and establishing at least 15 special U.S. attorneys to prosecute the bad actors. And I also want to offer my thanks to Representative Escobar, Jackson Lee, and Garcia for their ongoing leadership on this issue. And I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this important bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Ross seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021, led by my colleague Representative Escobar, addresses real harms incurred to vulnerable immigrant communities that fall prey to notario fraud. Spanish-speaking immigrants in particular often face confusion about the role and power of notaries and can be led to believe that notaries are legally authorized to provide legal services. I have seen this in my state. These predatory practices have immense and often irreversible consequences on immigrant communities. Fraudulent notary practices can lead to the missing of key deadlines and the filing of incorrect, incomplete, and false claims with the government, leaving individuals with not only missed opportunities to obtain legal residency, but the possibility of facing criminal liability and deportation. I represent a district with a large immigrant population that's benefited from rigorous enforcement of state laws that prohibit notary fraud. However, not all states have these laws. I'd like to highlight the leadership of North Carolina's Secretary of State, Elaine Marshall, who has led the charge in preventing notario fraud by increasing the capability of the state to investigate misconduct, and has worked with the state bar to provide continuing legal education for attorneys that help identify notario misconduct. She's also improved methodologies to positively identify document signers. But again, all states do not have these protections, and that is why we need this important piece of legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Scanlon seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting this legislation for our consideration today, and thank you to my friend, Representative Escobar, for introducing this important bill. As co-chair of the Legal Aid Caucus and someone who's worked for decades to expand access to legal services for those in need, I've seen how important access to quality legal counsel is. This is especially true in immigration matters, where our complicated laws and broken bureaucracy are difficult to navigate, even with legal counsel. But I've heard too many heartbreaking stories from vulnerable immigrants who were defrauded by notarios, posing as legitimate immigration experts. These notarios take advantage of the complexity of our immigration system and the fears of immigrants seeking to navigate it in the hopes of making a better life in our country. And the impact of these fraudulent notarios is devastating. Not only do they extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from families who count on them for sound legal advice, but they often, through fraud or incompetence, irreparably damage legitimate opportunities for immigrants to gain visas, green cards, and other legal immigration status. That's why I'm so proud to support this legislation, which would criminalize unlawful notarial schemes, as well as any threats and retaliation associated with those schemes. Additionally, I'm pleased that this legislation would allocate DOJ resources to ensure that notarial fraud is rooted out and stopped before it can ruin the lives of immigrants looking for legal counsel. Ensuring access to quality, affordable legal aid should be a priority for our committee and this Congress. And part of that effort lies in rooting out bad actors who aim to take advantage of vulnerable individuals looking for legal assistance. I encourage my colleagues to support the Fight Notarial Fraud Act, which would make meaningful change for immigrants across our country. Thank you again to my colleagues for your leadership and your focus on this important issue. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Point of order is reserved. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4435, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona. Add at the end of the bill the following. Section 3, inadmissibility and deportality.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Chairman, my amendment is quite simple. I mean, we've heard a lot of passion about the gravity of notario fraud, and I'm not minimizing it at all. I think that it probably does, and it is such a problem, quite frankly, because it is being this type of fraud and this kind of action is being used to prey on aliens who are living in the United States. And those who are holding themselves out to be immigration specialists, they take the money of unsuspecting aliens in that way. They're not the kind of people, if they are foreign nationals, that we really want in the United States. They have violated a very serious law. They've impersonated lawyers. They've, and you guys on the other side have really cataloged all the things that can happen and the impact on lives. I was kind of surprised that you left it a misdemeanor, though. So what my amendment does is it ensures that a foreign national who commits notario fraud, as defined by this bill, is both inadmissible to and deportable from the United States. See, a misdemeanor conviction is not enough for the Biden administration to make an alien a priority for removal. So the least we can do, in my opinion, is to speak with a strong, unified voice that people who commit these types of crimes, who are here and they're foreign nationals, they should be removed from the country. I hope that all of my colleagues will work with me to convince the Biden administration that aliens who commit notario fraud and all other aliens convicted of crimes should be removed from the United States of America. Now, when I look at this too, what I find interesting is I think there's an additional flaw in the bill. I'm not going to offer an amendment. I mean, I don't know that it necessarily is appropriate for me to offer that amendment, but I wish you would consider this. When you get to, on the 5th page, line 19, linguistic competence. I understand that you want linguistic competence, but I want to give you some context. You're going to have 15 special U.S. attorneys, and their linguistic capability, their multilingual capability will be considered. The way this is structured here, I hope they speak a lot of languages, because, for instance, in the Yuma sector, just about 6-8 weeks ago when I was down there, the #1 country from which people were being apprehended was Brazil. And I talked to the head of the station. I said, well, how are you doing? Because that's a Portuguese-speaking nation. He says, we don't have interpreters. We don't have translators. That's a problem. What was #2? Russians. Had trouble getting Russians speakers to translate. Romanians, the big groups the two big groups I saw when I was down there, Romanians. That's a problem. So when you have this kind of clause here, you might have an unintended consequence that you can't fulfill the qualification requirement for your U.S. Attorney General, Assistant U.S. Attorney General. I raised that because I don't know that that's intentional. I suspect it's not, but I think it possibly could be a problem. I don't think you're going to have a problem with more common languages like Spanish or even French, but there's also Mandarin and Cantonese speakers. There are Farsi speakers that have come across, and I would assume that some of them are also victimized by notario fraud. The reason I say that is because in my district you can go and you can find many notarios in storefronts, shopping centers, and so if you're coming across, regardless of what country of origin, you might end up there instead of at a lawyer. Now, I would just raise one other issue that does concern me, and I raised this, and it's not meant. I don't mean to be offering this with humor, but I'm trying to figure out why the state bars, to know they're not enforcing provisions against attorneys practicing law. I wish you would, and I think you're trying to correct that, but I think it so I agree. I hope it's and with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Insist on her point of order.
I do insist on the point of order, Mr. Chairman. The amendment purports to amend Section 8 of the U.S. Code, whereas the bill is entirely about Title 18 of the U.S. Code, and therefore beyond the scope of the bill and does not remain.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will be heard on the point of order.
Yes, I'm heard if I might.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize that we're talking in two different sections, but of the U.S. Code. But I think what's important to understand is if you go to page 2 and you begin looking at under section 2 and you start going through everything, and particularly on page
7 of Rule 16.
would appeal the ruling of the chair.
I move to table.
Motion to table is made. The motion to table is not debatable. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee.
In a non-definitive sense, no?
Mr. Cohen.
I'm going to put you on hold for 1 second. Aye.
Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass.
You're muted.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Sorry.
Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Raskin, you're muted.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demmings. Ms. Demmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones. Ms. Ross. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Goomert. Mr. Isa. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe.
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach.
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Owens.
Owens, no.
Mr. Owens votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Isa, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Isa votes no.
How am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee, you are not recorded.
Yes. Yes.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes yes.
Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Recorded, yes. How am I recorded?
Mr. Shabbat?
Mr.
Mr.
Shabbat, you're
Shabbat,
not
how am I
recorded.
recorded? You should have saw, I don't think it hears me.
We're not recorded.
Okay, no,
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
thank you.
The clerk will still report.
That was pretty impressive, wasn't
Mr. Chairman, there are 20 ayes and 14 noes.
Mr. Biggs' motion to appeal the chair's ruling in his amendment is laid on the table. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Correa seek recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the table.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4435, offered by Mr. Correa of California. Page 6, after line 3, insert the following and
The amendment will be
redesignate.
considered as read. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this most important markup today, and I want to thank Ms. Escobar, the sponsor of this bill, for reintroducing it once again. This bill holds criminals accountable for their crimes for misrepresenting their qualifications to practice immigration law. In my district, this is a minor crime that happens every day that adds up to millions and millions of dollars of damage. A few years ago, the Guadalupana law firm made the local headlines before a local district attorney shut them down. This firm was made up of crooked attorneys, bad notaries who took millions of dollars from hardworking immigrants. And by the time authorities shut them down, they had fled the country. And the worst of it is that these attorneys and advisors recommended that their victims sign documents that were not true, resulting in many of these victims permanently being disbarred from legalization, or barred, I should say, from legalization. I support this Notario Fraud Act, but there's so much more that needs to be done. Let's not forget the real damage is to the victims. They should have at least the opportunity to seek monetary restitution. That's why my amendment requires that practicing immigrant attorneys and accredited immigration representatives have adequate errors and omissions insurance so that victims may be compensated at least partly for their harm. And with that, I support the bill and I withdraw my amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chair.
Reserve a right to object.
What purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Point of order is reserved.
4435, offered by Mr. Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. Page 3, after line 19.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would start with saying, once again, we find ourselves kind of in a position of the bill is got a laudable goal, and obviously with what we're hearing and what's been demonstrated today is that this is needed. But I think I do have an amendment before the committee that would once again tighten things up, make things a little bit more succinct, and actually, I think, improve on the statutes. I guess I would also say I'm disappointed that Mr. Correa had withdrawn his amendment, because actually what I'm seeing is that amendment kind of speaks to what we are recognizing as one of the issues, and that is, once again, the cartels. And let me further describe, by definition, they're more transnational criminal organizations. Just, you know, I know that there's different terms that are used sometimes for the cartels, but I wanted to just reiterate that, you know, this is a global issue, not just something happening within the borders, certainly of the United States, but also our bordering countries. So what this amendment would do is, and DOJ has been asking for some of this stuff. They have been trying to root out immigration law fraud and prosecute notarial fraud under mail and wire fraud. That's been going on. It's been going on for a long time. So, because obviously we know fraud's never acceptable, and it's an unauthorized practice. I don't know if you want to call it a shell game, and the way it's been described numerous times is misrepresentation of legal services. So this amendment would allow judges to increase sentencing for any violation of this act when the individual involved is, guess what? Related to the cartels, related to these transnational criminal organizations. And you would say, well, how would you determine that? Well, the way you would determine it is by the case or by trying to prosecute. You know, that's how this would emerge. That's where this would come from, is in that prosecution. Because that would reveal the connection. Because otherwise, what we are led to believe, based on what we're seeing today, is that these are all just individuals operating on their own. Come on. That's not true. We know that's not true. So I think this amendment goes a long way to, once again, improving the bill, improving the efforts of the author. I applaud Representative Escobar in what's going on here. But again, I think this amendment addresses something that clearly is happening and would make this bill much better. And I would yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I
Strike last word.
move to strike the last word.
Oh, do you insist on your point of order?
I had the point of order. I do not insist on my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn.
It is withdrawn.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I'm pretty confident that every single member of this committee opposes the drug cartels. I mean, that's a given. And most of them are transnational organized crime. But I don't know really what else is transnational organized crime. To be honest, although I have watched these predators for many years, the notorios, I've never once, even when there have been local prosecutions, there's never been an instance where they were connected with the cartels. So I think this is worthy of further investigation, but I think the drafting of this is loose enough that I don't know that we would know what we would be voting to approve. So I couldn't support this today, but I do, and I don't think there's really any nexus, honestly, between the notorios and the cartels, although if there is, certainly we would want to do something about that. But whether or not there's a connection between the notorios and the cartels are a threat. They're a threat to our country, and they're a threat to individuals who run into them, whether those individuals are documented or undocumented. They're a threat to our law enforcement officers. They're bad dudes, and we're against them.
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
I would be happy to yield.
I thank the gentlelady, and I guess the question that occurs to me as I hear your argument in response to this amendment is, what harm does it do? It would apply enhanced penalty if someone who's engaging in this conduct that the bill seeks to strike at also is a conspirator with one of the cartels.
Reclaiming my time, transnational organized crime is not defined, and that's the concern. When we pass a law providing for imprisonment of 4 years, I think we ought to know specifically what the terms mean, and we do not know what the terms mean in this amendment. That doesn't mean that I'd be happy to yield. That doesn't mean that we couldn't find out. We could. We could have a hearing, we could do some research, but I don't think we know at this moment what that term means, and I'd happy to yield to the gentlelady who's done so much good work on this bill. To the gentlelady who's done so much good work on this bill, gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lofgren, Representative Lofgren. To my colleagues, I think you know I represent El Paso, Texas, on the southern border, a border community. Before I was in Congress, I served in local government, and so I've been fortunate to be a public servant for a long time for my community. I have, even as a local elected official, I received complaints from community members about notario fraud. I have never once heard they are linked in any way that is identified in this amendment. And as close to the community as it gets. In crafting this bill and speaking with colleagues from across the country, I have never once heard that this is an issue. I would be very interested in any examples that you all might have come across, because if there is an example, I'd love to explore, talk about it, and as Ms. Lofgren mentioned, let's even have a hearing about it. And I will tell you, someone who believes that the cartels are evil, and the way that they prey on one of the most vulnerable human beings is detestable, horrific. And so I absolutely stand with anyone who wants to legislate to create better safety for the vulnerable against the evil that is the cartel. But I think it's so important to make sure legislate to solve a problem that exists and we don't create overreach for something that doesn't exist. And so I would love the examples that might exist, but after years in public service, I have not. And thank you so much, Ms. Lofgren, for yielding. I appreciate the time.
For yielding back, I would just note that over the years, I've run across cases where just horrendous actions have occurred because of this fraud. And it's important that this bill, which I think has a match in the Senate, and pass along the lines that can pass in the United States Senate, because real harm is being done to innocent people who are trying to comply with the chairman.
Yields back, recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And I wonder, it seems to me that this is, I have a hard time seeing what's difficult about this. I do understand the comment of the gentlelady from California, I guess, in a technical way, that there's no definition in the amendment of a transnational organized crime. But then again, I doubt that's a very big obstacle. And I don't see what mischief could occur because it's not a term that is likely to be thought of as ambiguous. Organized crime's pretty clear. Transnational organized crime's pretty clear. And so the possibilities, or the problem, it seems to me, would exist if a court were to over-interpret it to include a bunch of stuff that wouldn't be included.
Mr. You
I'd be delighted to yield.
I just want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentlelady from California. This is a criminal statute, and so there are significant problems if definitions are not provided, because you have to provide notice to a defendant or an accused of what the circumstances are that led to the charges that have been leveled against him. I was a practicing criminal defense lawyer for many, many years. You can't leave it up to courts to decide what those terms mean, because that doesn't provide sufficient notice to an accused. It raises serious due process questions.
Reclaiming my time, and I'd be delighted to perhaps extend more time but just to engage in something in the nature of a colloquy if we could. I would submit that we were just in a very long markup over some bills that had great potential impact, that had some terms that were extraordinarily broad and ambiguous and not defined, like critical trading partner, if that rings a bell. And so invariably, courts have to interpret words that Congress has not defined with great precision, but I would contrast this situation with that one and invite the gentleman from Rhode Island to comment on that.
Yeah, of course. Well, there's obviously a very significant difference between a criminal statute that imposes penalties of imprisonment and requires due process considerations that don't exist in the civil context. So they're completely different.
One second. I thank the gentleman, and perhaps to facilitate or solve the problem, I seek to be recognized to offer a second-degree amendment. Mr. Chairman.
Seeking to be recognized to offer second-degree amendment.
I seek to be recognized to offer a second-degree amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
And the amendment is at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Yeah.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment.
Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Who controls the time right now?
I've just sought to be recognized for a second-degree amendment and was so recognized.
Okay.
Amendment 35, offered by Mr. Bishop. Page 3.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman, and I assume I get a new 5 minutes. Yes. Right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this amendment will interpose the language following the term transnational organized crime. And I think that solves the problem to which Mr. Cicilline spoke. And again, it seems to make great sense. It certainly ought to have any concerns whatsoever about Mr. Fitzgerald, because all his amendment does, for goodness sake, is say if someone who's engaged in this notario fraud that the bill strikes at is also engaged in this transnational organized crime that we all know, and Ms. Lofgren made the comment, everybody's against it, and frankly, the enhancement's not that significant. There are crimes, penalties as long as 3 years against these involves, I think, a matter in more than $10,000. And in this case, it would then, it just extends it to 4 years if the person's participating with the cartel. How easy should that be?
Would the gentleman yield?
So I understood someone wanted me to yield back here. Is that correct or no? No. Okay. Yes, I'd be delighted to yield. The majority would be delighted. The majority certainly opposing transnational organized crime, certainly be opposed to the cartels, as the gentlewoman from California indicated everyone is. Let's dispense with this quickly. And
Mr. Bishop, will you yield for a question?
I do yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
I don't think anyone questions your intention here, but I guess my question is this. I think you're conflating two problems. I think we all agree transnational crime and organized crime is a serious problem. Maybe the notarios fraud that is the subject of the bill may be less familiar to you, but these are crimes which are committed against the immigrant community relative to accessing legal services or immigration services, where people are essentially defrauded of money in their effort to either stay in this country or go through some immigration process. That's not a fertile area for organized crime. This is victims of defrauding individuals who are trying to access legal services. So let me just finish real quickly.
Reclaiming my time. I get your point, Mr. Cicilline, but to respectfully, the response to that is, well, then there should be no harm. If a notario is also a member of a cartel, then they get an enhanced sentence. Who can be opposed to that? It's really easy. So even if it's not likely that these reprehensible notarios we're hearing so much about could also be a member of the Mexican cartel, I mean, I don't know why that's so implausible, but then again, I'm from North Carolina. But I submit that we've solved the problem of the definition. That cleans up the due process problem. I appreciate your contribution on that point. We've cleaned this up. We could really get this dispensed with very quickly, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Madam
Does anyone else wish to be heard? Ms. Jackson Lee is recognized.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Bishop. as I strike the last word, and also I withdraw my point of order, let me just say that your amendment is worthy of further discussion, but I do believe my colleague and my colleagues, plural, are seeing these every day in their districts, Congressman Escobar, Congressman Garcia, and myself. We're seeing the real life, daily, in the United States, domestic-based individuals who are seeking, and let me just read very quickly. Immigrants hire these persons to file taxes, work on immigration papers, and handle other legal matters. Scammers then steal their tax return money, overcharge clients, and botch paperwork. These are some of the things. They're also, their culture, they're coming from a country where a notario is someone that is highly esteemed, is respected in the community, has all these credentials to practice law, though they're not. So when they come across this person in the United States, of course, they assume this is a person that could help with my immigration case. But I do think you have some Achilles heels. The definition, even though you tried to amend it, and the expanse of what you do in this as opposed to what the bill is. The bill is narrowly framed to deal with these scammers that attack our constituents every day. And so I would make the argument that we can do this another time. Hate to say that, we've said that before, and that we can address the complexity of transnational organizations dealing with immigration crime or dealing with crime. With that, I would have to oppose the amendment and the underlying amendment, and also, as I conclude, hoping that we will pass Ms. Escobar's bill. I ask that we support the underlying bill. I think it is a vital change to, in essence, really saving lives, because what happens is these people find out what has happened to them, the fraud, 15 years later, and they are in the mix of the immigration process to be deported, their children separated from them. It is a mess. This bill is long overdue and it is needed, and I think we should move quickly. As I say that, let me thank all of my colleagues for voting on bills out of the Crime Subcommittee in a bipartisan manner. Maybe you'll do that in this bill. And I want to thank the Crime Subcommittee staff for doing an excellent job for getting these bills out. Again, I ask that you support the Escobar bill, H.R. 4435, and that we do it in a bipartisan manner because it is needed. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else wish to be recognized? Mr. Tiffany is recognized to strike the last word.
Yeah, I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think part of the reason that we want to include this amendment, we may not get another opportunity. And it appears to me that we have, as the gentlelady from Texas just said, this is a worthy bill. And but this is a great opportunity, a golden opportunity, to be able to make sure that we deal with something that's very serious. I mean, we just heard from the gentleman from California. He was talking about, he broke up a ring, or they broke up a ring in, what was it, the LA area or something like that? I'm assuming that's where they're at. And they said they escaped across the border. You don't think that they were colluding? That sounds to me like that could be a transnational organization that was doing that. So, so I think that this is a great opportunity to be able to deal with an example that just came to us, and making sure to close a loophole and give us greater ability to be able to make this law even more effective and be able to get at people that are doing something that is really wrong to fellow human beings. And so I think the gentleman from Wisconsin, Representative Fitzgerald, really came forward with a good amendment here. And us being able to close this loophole with the transnationals and include them in the bill to make this bill really work to deal with a terrible situation that happens to people, I think this is a terrific opportunity. And as the gentlelady from Texas was saying, we should move quickly on this. We can dispense with the whole thing really quickly here by voting for this, and I urge everybody to vote yes to Mr. Fitzgerald's amendment, and let's put on the second amendment also, the secondary amendment, and I think we'll have had a good day in regards to this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'd like to ask unanimous consent that we add an E to the last word. I'm sure that was what Mr. Fitzgerald intended, more than one country, not more than on country. And without objection, that is done. Who else wishes? Mr. Johnson of Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move to strike the last word, and I rise in opposition to the amendment. And while I am sympathetic with the goals of this legislation, which seeks to get at notarial fraud, I have not been convinced that we need to make a federal case out of it. In the state of Georgia, such misconduct would constitute an everyday theft by deception or some other kind of fraud that is recognized under state law. And I assume that most states would have statutes in place that would get at the misconduct that this legislation seeks to get at. And with there being very slight evidence of any transnational activities with respect to garden variety notarial fraud, you know, then it means that there's generally no organized conspiracy. It's just individuals set up on a street corner in a shop that advertise, and then they get a victim in there and they don't do the work that they promised to do, or they do it such that it is not effective, or sometimes they just skip off with the money and do absolutely nothing. But those are like garden variety theft cases. And so when we insert in the federal statutes a specific provision on notarial fraud, which primarily takes place in Latino communities across the United States, then we're opening up federal agents and federal prosecution focused on Latino areas and focused on Latinos. And I'm just, you know, I'm not convinced that we need to go this far to get at this issue. I'm thinking it's more of a state issue, but I'm still open-minded, and I'm looking forward to hearing, continuing to listen to the debate as we move forward on this markup. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? Mr. Raskin is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Perhaps it's unnecessary to get too much more deeply into it, but I just want to point out that the so-called secondary or clarifying amendment just adds multiple new layers of confusion, ambiguity, and vagueness to it. If you look at the insertion on the amendment, it says any person who violates subsection A, B, or C and who participates or conspires to participate in transnational organized crime, then the insert is, which is an offense whose inception, perpetration, or direct or indirect effects involve more than, I think that's one country. So basically with this amendment, we've defined an entity, which is transnational organized crime, as an offense whose inception or perpetration or direct or indirect effects involve more than one country. What would it mean to say that, okay, you've got international organized crime, if it is a crime or if it is an offense or its indirect effects relate to more than one country? What are the indirect effects of a crime? You could say that's everything. So, I believe the underlying bill is excellent and addresses a serious problem based on real empirical research that is actually going to advance the public interest. All of this just seems to me to be like legislative graffiti. It's just scrawling a bunch of ideas on paper, and it doesn't advance a real public interest. So I thank the author of the bill and those who are, struggling to add an amendment. But if you want to deal with the problem of transnational organized
Will the
crime,
gentleman yield?
yes, by all means.
So, do I understand that the UN definition of transnational crime is, in your view, what was it? Legislative graffiti?
Well, certainly in this context it is. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know if all the misspellings were part of the original, but I don't like the way the United Nations spells perpetration or the word one. So yeah, I guess I would stick to American law rather than use UN law. That's what we're doing here. It seems to me that this is an ill-advised road to go down here, and there's a well-developed body of law dealing with transnational organized crime. And if you've got some ideas on how
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, by all means.
There's also a well-developed body of law on dealing with the unauthorized practice of law, isn't there?
Well, not with respect to notarios, because this is a criminal statute. I think what you're talking about is either bar discipline or else the unauthorized practice.
Under state law.
I don't know whether that's ever been used before in this context. Do you know whether it has been?
May I ask you, sir, do you know whether there is any other subject matter where the unauthorized practice of law is prosecutable under federal law as opposed to by state authorities under state law?
Well, that's the whole purpose of the legislation, is to deal with this problem.
So the answer is no. You're not, for example, in bankruptcy practice, in tax practice, in trademark practice, you're not aware, are you, sir, of any other area where the unauthorized practice of law, the law of that, has been federalized and criminalized?
Well, sure. Under mail fraud, for example, there are people who would pretend to be lawyers who are prosecuted under the mail fraud statute or the wire fraud statute.
For the unauthorized practice of law?
Fraud.
If they pretend to be a lawyer and they defraud people out of their money, sure. Yeah, I can find you a lot of cases like that. In any event,
Madam Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Raskin's time has not yet expired.
Okay. So Madam Chair, this is just to say that what we've got is a very worthy underlying legislative vehicle, and the amendment strikes me, whether it comes from the United Nations or somewhere else, it doesn't fit here. And I think it would just add a lot of chaos and confusion to the federal law. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Bishop?
Yes, I withdraw the second degree amendment.
Madam Chair, I seek recognition to offer second degree amendment.
I'm sorry. First, we have to get, by unanimous consent, we will withdraw the second degree amendment. And hearing none, that second degree amendment is withdrawn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I seek recognition to offer a second degree amendment.
You are recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And
Clerk will report.
Amendment to H.R. 4435, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona, page 3.
By unanimous consent, the amendment will be considered as read, and the clerk will will hand out the amendment. And a point of order has been reserved by the gentlelady from Texas. You're recognized.
thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate the procedural safeguard to reserve a point of order, but this is basically, the first part of this amendment is exactly the same as the last part. The only thing that's different is, since there seems to be such a concern about the definition, what we've done here is we've actually defined it with the definition of transnational organized crime in Section 10 U.S.C. Section 284 I-6. So in that definition it says, and I want to read this so everybody understands what it says, so maybe it will clear it up and maybe ameliorate some of the concerns that I've heard. Number one, this is it. This is what it says. The term transnational organized crime means self-perpetuating associations of individuals who operate transnationally for the purpose of obtaining power, influence, monetary or commercial gains wholly or in part by illegal means, while protecting their activities through a pattern of corruption or violence or through a transnational organization structure and the exploitation of transnational commerce or communication mechanisms. And so you actually have the definition that is in the United States Code being inserted into this amendment being offered by Mr. Fitzgerald. Poor Mr. Fitzgerald, he thought he was offering a simple amendment that nobody could disagree with, and then we're trying to make it better.
The gentleman yield?
I'll yield to you, Mr. Bishop.
It would seem that whatever problem of legal graffiti might have existed with my second-degree amendment has been 100% resolved with yours. Would you agree?
Mr. Bishop, I would wholly agree, and if Mr. Cicilline was here, he'd be calling you Mr. Biggs and me Mr. Bishop. But either way, I would agree. And we put this in here to make it very clear because I think maybe some of the questions were justified, although, you know, I used to do some international legal work, and I thought the UN had actually had some problems with its vernacular from time to time. But I think now you're going to be arguing against the U.S. Code because we've taken the language from the U.S. Code, trying to ameliorate some of the concerns of my colleagues across the way. I think that resolves it. I don't want to belabor the point, Madam Chair. We've had a lot of discussion today about this, and I don't think any of us thought we'd be having this kind of lengthy discussion. But I would say I hope we've ameliorated the concerns, and with that, I yield back to the
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the second-degree amendment, and let me say why. I appreciate the effort that's been made to make this more certain and to address the ambiguities. But I think there are still some drafting issues that it's not clear that there needs to be conspiracy related to, and I've just pulled up, and I hope that Cornell law is right in terms of having the code online, but presumably they are. I would recommend that, you know, we take a step back and look at whether the issue of transnational crime and notorios are actually related at all. I don't believe there's any evidence that they are. If there is, I think we would have a bipartisan effort to do something about it. And I think this has gotten, of course, we're the Judiciary Committee. If we can complicate something, we will. But I think that at this point, we would be better off moving on to the bill itself, agreeing to talk together about whether the cartels are in fact at all connected with the abuses that we're finding in the notario business, and if so, make a pledge to work together on a bipartisan basis to deal with that. Does any other member wish to be heard on this second-degree amendment? Hearing none, the question is on the second-degree amendment. All in favor will say aye. All opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
We have the ayes and noes. Yeses
The yeas and nays
yeses
have
and
been
nays.
requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee?
No.
Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
No.
Ms. Bass votes no.
Thank you.
Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
No, Swalwell's a no. Swalwell's
Mr.
no.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stemmings? Ms. Stemmings votes no. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Garcia.
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath. Mr. Stanton.
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean.
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar.
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones. Ms. Ross.
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush.
Bush votes no.
Happy
Ms.
birthday.
Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat.
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Isa.
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock.
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach. Ms. Fishbach.
You're muted, Michelle.
Yes. Ms. Fishbach votes yes. Ms. Sparts.
No. Nadler votes no.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Sparts.
Sparts, yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Ms. Scanlon, you are not recorded. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Benz.
Mr. Benz votes yes.
Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Owens.
Owens, aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
How is Ms. Jackson Lee recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee, you are recorded as no.
Mr. Liu was attempting to be having technical difficulties. Has Mr. Liu voted?
Mr. Liu is recorded as no.
Okay. Does any other member?
How is Rep. McBath quoted?
Ms. McBath, you are not recorded.
McBath, no.
Ms. McBath votes no.
Does any other member wish to be recorded? If not, the clerk will report the vote.
Madam Chair, there are 15 ayes and 21 noes.
And the second-degree amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the underlying Fitzgerald amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Opposed will say no.
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 Yeas and days?
I was going to say, I believe that the noes have it, but the yeas and nays have been requested, and so the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler. Ms. Lofgren.
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Bass?
Bass votes no.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline?
No.
Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu?
No.
Mr. Liu votes no. Mr. Raskin? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stemmings? Ms. Stemmings votes no. Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath?
No.
Ms. McBath votes no. Mr. Stanton?
No.
Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones? Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa?
Aye.
Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates?
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes yes. Ms. Fishbach?
Yes.
Ms. Fishbach votes yes. Ms. Sparts?
Sparts, yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz?
Bentz votes aye.
Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Owens?
Owens, aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
Are there additional members wishing to cast their vote?
Raskin votes no.
Mr. Raskin votes no.
Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Are there further members wishing to cast their vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 15 ayes and 20 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does Mrs. Cicilline seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to report that we'll now return to the actual bill before us. And I want to thank my colleague, Congresswoman Escobar, for introducing this important piece of legislation. All too often, notaries painting themselves as legal service providers take advantage of immigrants seeking legal help. These fraudsters, often referring to themselves as notarios, take advantage of the fact that in many Latin American countries, a notario público can provide legal services. Here, however, that is not the case, as being a notary does not license you to practice immigration law. These fraudsters offer legal services to victims who believe they have hired a capable professional as they navigate our complex immigration system, but the providers are not actually qualified or certified to provide legal services at all. Victims often pay thousands of dollars and put their hopes and trust in these imposters, and they're left in the dust when they don't receive the help that is promised. These notarios often make mistakes in court filings and with other documents, which can have disastrous and sometimes irreversible harm on an immigrant status and on a particular case. There are also cases where the notarios skip town, often taking the victim's important legal and other documentation with them. A lucrative business for these notarios has grown out of deception and the suffering of thousands of victims. And I know firsthand, having received complaints about this when I was mayor and continue to receive complaints about these individuals as a member of Congress, this bill will help crack down on this abhorrent practice by making it illegal to provide fraudulent immigration services or misrepresent oneself as having a license to practice law. It also will require the Department of Justice to dedicate 15 attorneys to investigate and prosecute such fraudulent practices, and would create a public list of those convicted of providing immigration services unlawfully so others know to be aware of such bad actors. This legislation is extremely important and will help protect thousands of people from being taken advantage of, strengthening our communities and our legal system in the process. I want to end by again thanking Representative Escobar for reintroducing this important legislation, for her commitment to this issue, and urge my colleagues to support this effort to root out deceptive and predatory practices in our communities. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does Mr. Bishop seek recognition?
to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I will say that until I sat down at this hearing today, I had sort of missed the significance of this bill and not thought about the context, just hadn't had time. And then I looked at it, and as a practicing lawyer for a long time, I took note of the fact that as far as I know, and this is something I was getting at with Mr. Raskin, as far as I know, this would be the only subject matter of law in which one engaging in the unauthorized practice of law would be subject to federal prosecution and criminal penalties. And before I go further, I wonder if the bill sponsor would yield to a question on that point. Ms. Escobar, would you yield to a question?
Certainly.
Am I correct about that? As I sat here doing a little bit of research, and the best I could do is, I pretty quickly got confirmation that the only place in which unauthorized practice of law could be federally criminal is in federal enclaves where the law of a state are brought in, like a federal, like Fort Bragg in North Carolina, something like that. Are you aware of any other place where the unauthorized practice of law is rendered criminal by federal law?
You know, I have tremendous respect for our colleague, constitutional expert Jamie Raskin, who mentioned that he could provide some examples. But to answer your question, if I may have a couple.
Well, I'm going to reclaim my time unless you answer it quickly.
Well, I'm trying to answer your question, but the point of this.
No. Do you know whether there are any other occasions in
I'm happy to look,
right. I'll reclaim my time.
into it and provide you examples.
I think what Mr. Raskin said is that he thought that the unauthorized practice could be prosecuted as garden variety fraud, perhaps, but then you wouldn't need a specific law. This would be the only case that I know of in which the unauthorized practice of law is made federal and criminal. I'm not even clear that in North Carolina the unauthorized practice of law is criminal. It can be acted upon by the bar, but I couldn't find any crime. So the problem with this is not only that it moves federal law into an area it's never been in, but the question is for whom, and compared to other situations, what are you doing? So if someone is involved in a matter on federal court and they're victimized by someone practicing law without a license, if they're in bankruptcy court, if they're in a federal trademark matter, and on and on and on, in which you're having people dealing with federal law issues, if they are victimized by someone not practicing law without a license, then
Mr.
they're
Bishop,
left to state.
will you yield to a question?
I will not. They're left to their state authorities to enforce the law there. And so what that means is, for the sake, and the people who are victimized here are people, in many cases, illegal immigrants into the country. And so this bill would give priority to those people under federal law over every American who may be victimized by the unauthorized practice of law. And in the course of doing that, the majority is unwilling even to add Mr. Fitzgerald's amendment to say, if the same person's a member of the Mexican cartel, we want to punish him a little more. No, we can't do that. We're in an environment where prosecutorial resources have been so minimized for the sake of enforcing the federal immigration law that I think the figure is that customs enforcement officers, 6,000 of them are arresting an average of 2 a month or something if people need to be deported. It's been de-emphasized to the point of disregard of the law. And where is the one place where the majority sees it as a critical priority to federalize and criminalize the unauthorized practice of law? That is where notarios are victimizing predominantly illegal immigrants into the United States. That's what you want to do. That is amazing to me.
That's not true.
Well, I'd be glad to yield for an answer as to why that's not true, as long as it's a fast
They
answer.
are not predominantly undocumented immigrants. In fact, a lot of victims of notario fraud are American citizens. If you spoke to your constituents, you would know.
If you say so. I would submit that these people who are pursuing asylum claims that they will never prevail on, that's probably a lot of the people that you're talking about. But to the extent they are American citizens, then answer me that. And on your own time, why should they be prioritized over every other American in the way the law deals with them in matters of unauthorized practice of law? And with that, my time's expired.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 4435 favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported.
Yeas and nays, please.
Favorably to the House. Recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Jackson-Lee. Aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass.
No.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries.
Point of parliamentary inquiry. Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman,
will state his point of
we're
parliamentary.
voting on final passage of the bill, correct?
Yes, we are voting on final passage of the bill. That is correct, sir.
Thank you.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Mr. Cicilline.
Aye.
Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Demmings. Ms. Demmings votes aye. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Yes.
Ms. Garcia votes yes. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes aye.
Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat?
Yes.
Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Yeah, but didn't vote no. I said pass.
Right, no?
Sorry, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Shabbat passes. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Isa?
No.
Mr. Isa votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Gates?
This isn't final passage, I think.
Mr. Gates?
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana?
No.
Figure it out.
Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs?
It was made.
Mr. Biggs votes no.
Good one. It's
Mr.
never been a
McClintock?
product to pretend
No.
to be a
Mr.
lawyer.
McClintock votes no.
There's
Mr.
a separate
Stubbe?
comment, but why are we creating you know how easily you could slip into
Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany
somebody
votes no.
thinking you're a lawyer when you're not. And be
Mr. Massey?
really
Mr. Massey
prosecuted.
votes no. Mr. Roy?
And, you know, and the witnesses against you will be undocumented aliens that you took money from.
Daryl, you on, buddy?
Daryl, mute your microphone, bud.
Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts?
Sparts, no.
Ms. Sparts votes no. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz?
Mr. Benz votes no.
Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Owens?
Owens, no.
Mr. Owens votes no.
Mr.
How am I
Deutsch?
recorded? Swalwell?
Mr. Deutsch?
Mr. Swalwell, you are not recorded.
I'll wait for Mr. Deutsch.
Deutsch, oh, sorry. Deutsch votes aye.
Mr. Deutsch votes aye.
Mrs.
Bass,
Swallow?
how am I?
Thank you. Swalwell votes aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye.
This is Bass, how am I recorded?
Ms. Bass, you recorded as no.
Please change that to aye.
Ms. Bass votes aye.
Shabbat, no.
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Are there any members who have not voted, who who have not been recorded, who wish to be recorded?
Bush, Chairman. Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no.
Are you, this is final passage, you know. Okay. The clerk will report.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, there are 20 ayes and 17 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. And with that, the business of today, this concludes our business for today. Thanks to all our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.